Story number 1. Echoes of the forgotten. I still wake up in the dead of night, heart pounding and drenched in sweat, haunted by the memory of that eerie bus ride through the quiet streets of Denver. It was a frigid December evening in 1987, the kind where the city lights flicker against the heavy blanket of fog rolling in from the mountains. Little did I know, that night would blur the lines between reality and the supernatural, leaving me with a lingering fear that still grips me to this day. I was 22, working the late shift as a dispatcher for the Metropolitan Transit Authority. The job was monotonous, filled with routine calls and the hum of city life outside my window. But that night, something felt different, a palpable tension that I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the isolation of the empty bus routes, or the oppressive silence that seemed to seep into every corner of my small office. Whatever it was, it set the stage for the nightmare that was about to unfold. At around 1:15 a.m., I received a call that there was a passenger requesting the last bus on Route 45, a night route that traversed some of Denver's less populated neighborhoods. As I relayed the information to the driver, a sense of unease settled over me. Route 45 was notorious for its desolate stretches, especially near abandoned buildings and forgotten schools that stood as silent witnesses to the passage of time. The driver, a seasoned man named Tom, assured me everything was under control. He was dependable, with a no-nonsense attitude that had kept him safe on countless late-night drives. I trusted him implicitly, but that night, my instincts screamed that something was off. As the bus pulled away from the depot, the cityscape gave way to empty streets and the dim glow of streetlights barely cutting through the fog. Tom kept the conversation light, discussing the usual topics of work and family, but his eyes occasionally darted to the rearview mirror, scanning the empty seats with a hint of apprehension. About 15 minutes into the route, just as we were passing by the old Lincoln High School, a relic from the 1950s that had been abandoned for decades, the air inside the bus grew inexplicably cold. My breath fogged up the glass of my monitor, and I glanced up to see Tom shivering slightly, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Everything all right, Tom?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the growing unease. He nodded, though his eyes betrayed his discomfort. "Yeah, just getting a chill from the cold tonight." I watched as he continued driving, but my attention was drawn back to the silence that had settled over the bus. It was unnerving. The usual background noise of the engine and the occasional squeak of the brakes was replaced by an oppressive stillness. That's when I heard it, a faint, giggling sound that seemed to echo from the back of the bus. "Tom," I whispered, leaning closer to my headset. "Are you hearing this?" He looked up, his expression shifting from casual to alarmed in an instant. "Hear what?" "The laughter," I replied, my voice barely audible. "There's someone laughing in the back." Tom's grip on the wheel tightened, his knuckles turning white. "I don't see anyone there," he muttered, glancing in the rearview mirror. But there was no one. The seats were empty, the back of the bus as desolate as the streets outside. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a stray animal, or the wind playing tricks on our ears. Yet, the laughter persisted, a soft, haunting sound that seemed to wrap around the bus like a ghostly embrace. "Tom, we need to check," I insisted, the fear in my voice undeniable. He hesitated, his eyes scanning the empty rows. "All right, but stay safe," he warned before cautiously moving the bus to the side of the road and turning off the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sounds of the city and the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. Tom grabbed a flashlight and stepped out of the bus, the cold night air biting at his exposed skin. I followed, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as we made our way to the rear of the bus. The empty seats stared back at us, untouched and unoccupied. My heart pounded in my chest as we searched every nook and cranny. But there was no sign of anyone or anything responsible for the laughter. Just as we were about to give up, a chill wind swept through the bus, and the laughter returned, louder this time, echoing through the empty seats. "It's over here," Tom whispered, his voice trembling. We turned back to the rear of the bus. And there, in the middle of the aisle, stood a figure, a young girl, no older than 8, her eyes hollow and vacant, her clothes tattered and old-fashioned. She was smiling, but there was no warmth in her expression, only an eerie emptiness that sent shivers down my spine. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She didn't answer, just continued to giggle, the sound now tinged with a sadness that was almost palpable. Tom took a step forward, but before he could reach her, she vanished, leaving behind only the lingering echo of her laughter. We stood there, frozen in terror, the bus seeming to close in around us. The air grew colder still, and I could feel the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me, the presence of countless lost souls trapped within the confines of the bus. The laughter turned into soft whispers, voices of children who had long since vanished, their stories forgotten by time. I knew then that we were dealing with something beyond our understanding, an entity that thrived on fear and sorrow, bound to the very route we were driving. The old Lincoln High School stood ominously in the distance, its windows dark and empty, a silent sentinel watching over the night. "Tom, we need to go," I urged, my voice shaking. "We need to leave." He nodded, his face pale but resolute, and we hurried back to the driver's seat. As we revved the engine, the whispers and laughter faded, replaced once more by the oppressive silence that had haunted us throughout the journey. The bus sped away from the deserted school, the city lights reappearing as we moved further into the heart of Denver. But the memory of that night remained, a haunting reminder of the thin veil between our world and the unknown. I never took the late-night bus again, but the image of the headless man and the ghostly laughter lingered in my mind, a constant presence that refused to fade. Years later, I still hear the whispers in my dreams, the echoes of that night in Denver replaying like a broken record. I've tried to move on, to forget the horrors that unfolded within the walls of that old bus. But the fear remains, a shadow that follows me wherever I go. Sometimes, when the night is particularly quiet and the city sleeps beneath its blanket of fog, I catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a fleeting shadow, a pair of hollow eyes staring back at me from the darkness. The whispers return, soft and insistent, urging me to remember, to acknowledge the presence that lingers just beyond the edges of my perception. If you ever find yourself riding a late-night bus in Denver, keep your eyes open and your senses sharp. You never know when the shadows will come alive, when a ghostly passenger will board your bus, or when a non-existent stop will lead you into the depths of a haunting mystery. Respect the boundaries between the living and the dead, for in the heart of the night, the whispers never truly fade, and the shadows watch, ever vigilant, ready to claim those who dare to venture too far into the unknown. Story number 2. The ghostly ticket. I still wake up in the dead of night, heart pounding and drenched in sweat, haunted by the memory of that eerie evening in Houston. It was December 1981, a night when the city lights struggled to pierce through the heavy fog that rolled in from the bayou. As the driver of Route 42, I was no stranger to late-night shifts, ferrying passengers through the quiet streets while most of the city slept. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered that night, a haunting encounter that blurred the lines between the living and the dead. It was just past midnight when I picked up the last passenger of the night at the downtown depot. The bus was nearly empty, save for a few weary souls seeking refuge from the cold. As I pulled away from the stop, the familiar hum of the engine and the rhythmic clatter of the tires on the wet pavement created a soothing backdrop. I glanced in the rearview mirror, ensuring everything was in order. When the doors swung open again, a man stepped onto the bus, his presence immediately unsettling. He was elderly, dressed in a worn trench coat that seemed out of place in the modern cityscape. His hat cast a shadow over his face, obscuring his features, but his eyes, if I could call them that, pierced through the darkness with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He handed me a ticket, old and yellowed, its edges frayed as if it had traveled through decades. "Route 42, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. There was no greeting, no polite nod, just a silent exchange that felt heavier than the weight of his presence. I took the ticket, slipping it into my pocket, and watched as he settled into a seat near the back, his gaze fixed on the window. The bus continued its journey through the deserted streets, the city's skyscrapers looming like silent sentinels against the night sky. The man's silence was unnerving, his stillness contrasting sharply with the occasional shuffle of feet and the distant hum of traffic. I tried to focus on my route, but the feeling of being watched gnawed at me, an invisible presence lurking just beyond my peripheral vision. As we rolled past the old riverside cemetery, the air seemed to grow colder, the fog thickening into a heavy mist that clung to the bus like a shroud. My breaths became visible, each exhale a ghostly puff in the dim interior. The man remained motionless, his eyes never leaving the window, staring into the abyss that lay ahead. I felt a chill settle over me, a premonition that something was terribly wrong. Minutes turned into hours, or so it felt, as we traversed the winding roads of Houston's outskirts. The city lights faded, replaced by the eerie glow of the moon reflecting off the damp asphalt. The bus rolled into a particularly desolate stretch, the surroundings growing more desolate with each passing mile. That's when I noticed it, the man's ticket. Curiosity got the better of me, and I reached into my pocket, pulling out the yellowed ticket. The date on it read July 4th, 1974. My heart skipped a beat as I realized the discrepancy. It had to be a mistake. Time travel wasn't something I believed in, no matter how late-night drives could distort reality. Yet, there it was, a relic from the past left in my possession. I glanced back at the man, who was still staring out the window, unchanged by the passage of time, or so it seemed. My mind raced, trying to rationalize the impossible. "Excuse me, sir," I began, my voice betraying my anxiety. "Is there a mistake with this ticket?" He didn't respond. Instead, he slowly turned his head, his hollow eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror. A shiver ran down my spine as I met his gaze, feeling an overwhelming sense of sorrow and longing emanating from him. "Route 42, he whispered again, his voice now tinged with desperation. "Never missed the last stop." Before I could respond, the bus jolted violently, the brakes screeching in protest. Panic surged through me as I fought to regain control, the bus swerving erratically down the deserted road. The lights flickered, and the engine sputtered, stalling mid-drive. The air grew thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the distant howling of the wind through the trees. I reached for the ignition, trying to restart the bus, but it refused to budge. The man remained seated, his presence growing more intense, as if he were drawing strength from the very essence of the night. My mind raced with fear and confusion. What was happening? Where were we? Suddenly, the bus windows began to frost over, the glass turning opaque and trapping us in a world of ice and shadows. My breath quickened, the cold seeping into my bones as the temperature inside the bus plummeted. The man stood up slowly, his silhouette outlined by the dim interior lights, and began to walk towards the front of the bus. "Why are you here?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own racing heart. He stopped inches away from me, his head tilted slightly, and stared into my eyes with an intensity that was both terrifying and heartbreaking. "I was waiting for you," he whispered, his voice echoing through the frozen silence. "I've been waiting for someone to find me." Before I could respond, the bus doors swung open, and a blinding light poured in, engulfing the interior in a radiant glow. The man vanished before my eyes, leaving behind only the yellowed ticket on his seat. The light dimmed as abruptly as it had appeared, and the bus engines roared back to life, resuming our halted journey. Confused and shaken, I tried to piece together what had just happened. The man, the old ticket, the sudden stall. It all felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. As we continued down the road, The fog began to lift, the city lights reappearing like distant stars in the early dawn. I glanced back at the empty seat, expecting to see the man once more, but it was completely vacant. The rest of the trip passed without incident, the eerie calm replaced by the familiar sights of morning. When we finally arrived at the depot, the first rays of sunlight piercing through the fog, I handed over the ticket to the bus dispatcher. He took it with a puzzled expression, his eyes scanning the date and details. "This ticket is from 1974, he remarked, a hint of disbelief in his voice. "But Route 42 hasn't existed since 1980. My stomach churned with fear and confusion. The memory of the man's hollow gaze etched into my mind. I left the depot with a heavy heart, the image of that ghostly passenger lingering like a shadow in my thoughts. I never spoke of that night to anyone, the fear of being labeled crazy keeping me silent. But the ticket remained with me, a tangible reminder of the night I crossed paths with the unknown. Years have passed since that haunting night, but the memory remains vivid, a constant reminder of the thin veil between our world and the supernatural. I often find myself avoiding late-night drives, the echoes of that encounter lingering in the back of my mind. But sometimes, when the city is cloaked in darkness and the fog rolls in thick from the bayou, I catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadowy figure standing silently in the aisle, staring directly at me with empty eyes. The whispers return, soft and insistent, urging me to remember, to acknowledge the presence that lurks just beyond the edges of my perception. I've learned to respect the boundaries between the living and the dead, understanding that some encounters are best left undisturbed, their mysteries forever entwined with the shadows of the night. If you ever find yourself driving Route 42 in Houston on a foggy winter night, keep your eyes open and your senses sharp. You never know when the past will reach out to claim another soul lost to the darkness, or when a ghostly passenger will board your bus, leaving behind only a silent ticket and a haunting memory that will never fade. Story number 3. Shadows in the aisle. I still wake up in the dead of night, heart pounding and drenched in sweat, haunted by the memory of that eerie bus ride through the shadowed streets of Boston. It was a chilly November evening in 1998, the kind where the city lights flicker against the encroaching darkness, and the cold air bites through every layer of clothing. That night, I learned that some shadows are best left undisturbed, and some mysteries are too unsettling to unravel. I was 12 years old, navigating the labyrinthine streets of Boston after a late study session at the library. My mom had let me take the bus alone for the first time, a small step towards independence that filled me with both excitement and trepidation. The bus, Route 24, was a late-night service that ran through some of the city's quieter neighborhoods, a route I usually took with my older brother, Mark. But tonight, Mark was out of town, and I was venturing out on my own. As I boarded the bus, the warmth inside was a welcome contrast to the biting cold outside. The interior was dimly lit, with only a few passengers scattered across the seats, students like me, late-night workers, and the occasional solitary traveler seeking solace from the night. I found an empty seat by the window, eager to watch the city pass by in a blur of lights and shadows. The bus started moving, the familiar hum of the engine and the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the asphalt creating a soothing backdrop. I pulled out my notebook, intending to jot down ideas for a school project, but my attention kept drifting to the world outside the window. The streets were slick with rain, reflecting the myriad of neon signs and streetlights that never seemed to dim under the heavy drizzle. About 20 minutes into the ride, as we approached the outskirts of the city, something unusual caught my eye. At the far end of the aisle, standing motionless, was a figure clad in an old-fashioned coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He was an elderly man, his posture rigid, his hands clasped tightly together. I felt a chill run down my spine, an inexplicable unease settling over me. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination. But the man's presence was too distinct to ignore. He remained still, staring straight ahead, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of his hat. The bus continued its journey, passing through increasingly deserted neighborhoods where the streets were dimly lit, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. As the bus rolled on, I couldn't help but steal glances at the man. Each time I looked, he was still there, an unchanging sentinel in the middle of the aisle. The other passengers seemed oblivious to his presence, lost in their own worlds, engrossed in books, conversations, or the glow of their phone screens. It was as if he existed in a separate plane, invisible to everyone except me. The air inside the bus grew colder, the warmth from the heater insufficient to dispel the creeping chill. My breath became visible in the dim light, and I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The man's silence was unnerving, his gaze fixed on the road ahead with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Minutes turned into hours, or so it felt, as we traversed the desolate streets of the outskirts. The bus driver, a middle-aged man with weary eyes, glanced in the rearview mirror occasionally, but I couldn't see him noticing the figure at the end of the aisle. My anxiety heightened with each passing minute, the man's unwavering stare becoming a constant source of unease. Finally, the bus approached a particularly desolate stretch of road, flanked by rows of abandoned buildings and overgrown vegetation. The sky was overcast, the clouds heavy with the promise of more rain. As we moved through this forgotten part of the city, the man's presence seemed to intensify, the shadows around him growing darker, more oppressive. I decided I couldn't take it anymore. The whispers of my racing thoughts drowned out any attempt at rationalization. Gathering my courage, I stood up and approached the man, my heart pounding in my chest. The other passengers watched me curiously, but I ignored their stares, driven by a need to confront the source of my fear. "Excuse me," I began, my voice wavering slightly. "Is everything okay?" The man turned his head slowly, and for the first time, I saw his face. My blood ran cold as I realized he had no head. His neck was bare, the place where his skull should have been an empty void, smooth and featureless. My scream caught in my throat as I stumbled back, my eyes wide with terror. The bus driver pulled over abruptly, the sound of screeching brakes cutting through the silence. Panic surged through me as I backed away, trying to comprehend the impossible sight. The man stood there, headless and motionless, his empty gaze still fixed on the road ahead. My mind raced with fear and confusion, unable to reconcile the reality before me with any semblance of logic. Without thinking, I bolted back to my seat, the other passengers now staring at me in alarm. "I saw him," I gasped, my voice shaking. He doesn't have a head." The driver approached cautiously, concern etched on his face. "Is everything all right, miss?" I couldn't find the words, the horror of the situation silencing me. The other passengers murmured among themselves, some offering comforting words while others looked on with a mix of skepticism and fear. The headless man remained standing at the end of the aisle, his presence a silent reminder of the thin line between reality and the supernatural. As the bus continued its journey, the figure began to fade, his form becoming less distinct, the shadows swallowing him whole. I watched in disbelief as the man vanished before my eyes, leaving no trace of his existence. The temperature inside the bus returned to normal, the chill dissipating as quickly as it had arrived. The rest of the ride was a blur, my mind unable to process the events that had just unfolded. I sat there, shaking and drenched in sweat, trying to make sense of what I had seen. The bus driver glanced at me once more, concern giving way to something else, fear, perhaps, mirrored in his eyes. When we finally reached my stop, I hurried off the bus, not looking back until I was safely inside my apartment. The image of the headless man lingered in my mind, a haunting reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved, some shadows better left undisturbed. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the memory of that night. I avoided the late-night buses, opting instead for safer, more predictable routes. My friends dismissed my story as a figment of my imagination, a product of a vivid nightmare. But I knew what I had seen. The city held secrets, dark and unspoken, lurking in the shadows of its forgotten streets. Years have passed since that fateful night, but the memory remains vivid, a constant reminder of the thin veil between our world and the unknown. I often find myself drawn back to the bus routes of Boston, the allure of the city's hidden corners calling to me like a siren's song. But I heed the warning of my past, respecting the boundaries that hold the shadows at bay. Sometimes, late at night, when the city is cloaked in darkness and the streets are empty, I catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadowy figure standing motionless in the aisle, eyes hollow and empty, staring straight ahead. The whispers return, soft and insistent, urging me to remember, to acknowledge the presence that lurks just beyond the edges of my perception. If you ever find yourself riding a late-night bus in Boston, keep your eyes open and your senses sharp. You never know when the shadows will come alive, when a silent rider will board, or when a non-existent stop will lead you into the depths of a haunting mystery. Respect the boundaries between the living and the dead, for in the heart of the night, the whispers never truly fade, and the shadows watch, ever vigilant, ready to claim those who dare to venture too far into the unknown. Story number 4. Silent stairs on Route 47. I still wake up in the dead of night, heart pounding and drenched in sweat. The memory of that bus ride in Los Angeles clinging to me like the lingering fog that blankets the city streets. It was a chilly October evening in 1981, the kind where the city lights blur into a hazy glow under the weight of a heavy mist. I never took the late-night bus again after that night, but the image of the man with the empty gaze remains etched in my mind, a ghostly reminder that some shadows refuse to fade. I was 14, working my first night shift at a diner near Union Station. The hours dragged on, the monotony of flipping burgers and cleaning tables making my eyelids heavy. Finally, the clock struck 2, and the shift manager nodded approvingly as I grabbed my worn-out backpack and headed out into the night. The city was quieter at this hour, the usual hustle and bustle replaced by an eerie stillness that sent shivers down my spine. I boarded Route 47, a bus that meandered through the less populated parts of the city, cutting through neighborhoods where the streets were dimly lit and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. The bus was nearly empty, just a few late-night travelers seeking warmth and a ride home. I chose a seat near the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of the sleeping city as I stared blankly ahead. As the bus rolled past familiar landmarks, the towering skyscrapers, the flickering neon signs, the abandoned storefronts, I felt a sense of unease settle over me. It wasn't the cold or the loneliness. It was something else, an intangible tension that prickled the back of my neck. I tried to shake it off, focusing instead on the rhythmic hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the old vehicle. That's when I saw him, a man stepping onto the bus at the next stop. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, a faded trench coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. His presence was jarring, as if he had stepped out of a different era and misplaced himself in the modern chaos of Los Angeles. He chose the seat directly behind me, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed intently on me. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but his gaze never wavered. He stared through me, his eyes hollow and empty, devoid of any warmth or recognition. My heart began to race, and I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, trying to ignore the unnerving sensation that he was watching my every move. The bus continued its route, the streets growing darker and more desolate as we ventured further from the city center. The lights from the windows cast long, distorted shadows on the man's face, making his expression even more unsettling. I glanced back at him occasionally, each time finding him staring blankly forward, as if lost in a void only he could see. Minutes turned into hours, and the night deepened around us. The bus ride felt endless, the man's silent stares becoming a constant source of anxiety. I wondered if anyone else noticed him, but the other passengers seemed oblivious, engrossed in their own worlds. It was as if he existed in a separate plane, his presence unnoticed by everyone except me. As we approached the final stretch of the route, the streets became quieter, the bus moving at a snail's pace through the deserted neighborhoods. My anxiety reached a peak as I realized we were nearing the last stop before the depot, a place I usually never went. But tonight, exhaustion and fear drove me to make my way back home alone. The bus finally pulled into the last stop, the doors swinging open to reveal an empty platform shrouded in darkness. I grabbed my backpack, my hands trembling as I prepared to disembark. But as I turned to leave, I noticed that the man was still seated behind me, unmoving, his head slightly tilted as if he were listening to something only he could hear. "Thank you," I muttered, trying to mask the quiver in my voice. I stepped off the bus, the chill of the night air wrapping around me like a shroud. I turned to wave goodbye, expecting to see the man stepping down with the rest of the passengers. But the bus had remained stationary for what felt like hours, the driver nowhere in sight. Confusion washed over me as I glanced back towards the bus. The man was still there, his seat empty. Panic surged through me as I realized that the bus hadn't moved since I had stepped off. I took a hesitant step closer, trying to make sense of the impossible sight. The man was gone, as if he had vanished into thin air, leaving no trace of his existence. My mind raced with questions. Had I imagined him? Was he a ghost, a relic of the past haunting the present? The absence of any evidence made it difficult to rationalize, but the fear in my chest told me that something supernatural had transpired. I stumbled back, my legs unsteady, and decided to head home the old-fashioned way, by walking through the silent streets. The night felt even colder now, the earlier mist thickening into a heavy fog that obscured my vision. Every sound seemed amplified, the distant sirens and the occasional howl of a stray dog echoing through the empty avenues. As I walked, the city seemed to stretch endlessly, the familiar landmarks becoming distorted under the blanket of darkness. My thoughts kept drifting back to the man on the bus, his hollow gaze haunting my every step, quickened my pace, eager to reach the safety of my apartment. But the sense of being watched intensified, as if unseen eyes were tracking my every move. Hours passed, or was it minutes? Time lost all meaning as I navigated the labyrinthine streets, the fear propelling me forward despite the growing exhaustion. Finally, the lights of my building came into view, a beacon of hope amidst the overwhelming darkness. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably, and managed to unlock the door. Inside, the warmth of my apartment enveloped me, a stark contrast to the cold night outside. I locked the door behind me, leaning against it as I tried to steady my breathing. The whispers of the night lingered in my mind, the man's empty gaze a permanent scar on my psyche. I sank into my couch, the exhaustion and fear washing over me like a tidal wave. In the days that followed, I avoided the late-night bus rides, opting for safer, more predictable routes. But the memory of that night never truly faded. The image of the man with the empty gaze haunting my dreams and coloring my waking hours with an unshakable dread. I couldn't explain what I saw, but the fear remained, a constant reminder that some shadows are better left undisturbed. Years have passed since that fateful night, but sometimes, when the city is cloaked in darkness and the bus routes stretch out into the silent streets, I catch a glimpse of an old-fashioned man with hollow eyes, watching me from the back of the bus. The whispers return, soft and insistent, urging me to remember, to respect the boundaries between the living and the dead. If you ever find yourself riding a late-night bus in Los Angeles, keep your eyes open and your senses sharp. You never know when the shadows will come alive, and the past will reach out to claim another soul lost to the darkness. Story number 5. The silent rest stop. I still wake up in the dead of night, drenched in sweat and haunted by the memory of that eerie evening in Seattle. It was a typical autumn night in 1992. the kind where the city lights blur into streaks of gold and orange under the heavy drizzle. Little did I know, that night would forever change my perception of reality and the thin veil that separates our world from the unknown. I was a relatively new bus driver for the Seattle Metropolitan Transit Authority, having started just 6 months prior. The job was straightforward enough: drive the route, pick up passengers, and drop them off at their destinations. Most nights were uneventful, filled with the monotony of familiar streets and the occasional late-night traveler seeking shelter from the cold. That night, Route 22 was particularly quiet. The streets were slick with rain, reflecting the myriad of neon signs and streetlights that never seemed to dim. I settled into the driver's seat, the hum of the engine and the rhythmic tapping of the rain against the windshield creating a soothing backdrop. My shift had just begun, and I was eager to prove myself. At around 1:15 a.m., a solitary figure approached the bus stop near Greenwood Park. He was an elderly man, hunched over a cane, his attire outdated, wearing a long, dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face. There was something unsettling about him, an aura of sadness that seemed to envelop his very presence. Without a word, he boarded the bus and took the seat directly behind me, his gaze fixed on the empty road ahead. I tried to shake off the unease, reminding myself that late-night passengers could be anyone. The bus rolled forward, the familiar sights of the city passing by in a blur. As we made our way through the quiet streets, the man remained silent, his eyes never leaving the window. I occasionally glanced in the rearview mirror, feeling an inexplicable sense of being watched. Around 2 a.m., the bus approached a stretch of road that seemed oddly deserted, flanked by rows of abandoned buildings and overgrown vegetation. According to the latest route map, we were nearing the Greenwood Cemetery, an old, neglected cemetery that had been largely forgotten by the city. I had heard stories about the place, tales of restless spirits and unexplained phenomena, but I had never paid them much mind. As we continued down the road, I noticed something strange. The GPS indicated that we were approaching a designated stop that, according to the map, didn't exist. Confusion washed over me as I cross-referenced the map, realizing that there was no official stop scheduled for this location. Glancing back at the elderly man, I saw his expression remain unchanged, his eyes now fixed on a spot just ahead of the bus. My unease grew when, suddenly, the bus came to an abrupt halt. I looked up to see that the bus had stopped in front of an area that didn't appear on any current map, an old, decrepit entrance surrounded by overgrown hedges and crumbling stone walls. My heart pounded as I realized that we had somehow arrived at an abandoned cemetery that wasn't listed as a stop. I turned to the man, hoping for some explanation, but he simply nodded and began to gather his belongings. "Are you sure this is the right stop?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. He didn't respond. Instead, he reached down and opened the door, stepping off the bus with the help of his cane. I watched him disappear into the shadows, the bus engine still idling as if waiting for him to return. Panic surged through me as I realized that no one had requested to disembark at this non-existent stop. I hurriedly shut the door, trying to shake off the fear that was beginning to take hold. Deciding to turn back was the only rational choice. But as I attempted to shift the bus into reverse, I noticed that the GPS and all other navigational aids had gone haywire. The dashboard lights flickered, and the bus seemed to resist my attempts to move. My phone, usually reliable, showed no signal. I was trapped, stuck between reality and something far more sinister. The air inside the bus grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly. The whispers of the past seemed to seep into the present, filling the confined space with a palpable sense of dread. I could almost hear the faint echoes of footsteps and distant cries, as if the spirits of the forgotten cemetery were trying to communicate, to warn me of the danger lurking within their eternal resting place. Desperate to escape, I tried everything to get the bus moving, but nothing worked. The engine refused to respond, and the doors remained locked, sealed by an invisible force. I began to panic, my mind racing with thoughts of being trapped in a haunted place, surrounded by the restless souls of the deceased. Suddenly, the bus shuddered violently, and the lights flickered once more before plunging the interior into complete darkness. My heart raced as I fumbled for the flashlight, the beam cutting through the blackness just enough to reveal the silhouette of the elderly man standing at the back of the bus. His face was still obscured by the shadow of his hat, but there was an intensity in his gaze that sent chills down my spine. "Why are you here?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my racing heart. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised his hand, and a cold wind swept through the bus, extinguishing the flashlight and leaving me in utter darkness. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling the space with their mournful lamentations. I could feel a presence pressing down on me, the weight of countless lost souls bearing down on my very being. In a last-ditch effort, I slammed my hand against the door, trying to break free from the invisible hold. The door gave way with a resounding crash, and I stumbled out into the night, gasping for breath. The bus remained stationary, the abandoned cemetery looming ominously in the distance. I turned to look back, expecting to see the man watching me, but there was nothing, no sign of him, no indication that he had ever been there. Shaken to my core, I ran back towards the city, the whispers fading behind me but the fear lingering like a shadow in my mind. When I finally reached the safety of my apartment, I collapsed onto the floor, the memory of that night etched into my soul. In the days that followed, I tried to rationalize the experience, telling myself it was a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew the truth. There are places where the veil between the living and the dead is thin, where the restless spirits of the past still linger, bound by their unfinished business and eternal sorrow. I returned to Route 22 a few weeks later, determined to put the experience behind me. The streets were just as quiet, the rain falling softly as I drove through the familiar route. I never encountered the elderly man again, and the mysterious stop never appeared on the map once more. Yet, every time I drive past the abandoned cemetery, a chill runs down my spine, and I can't help but wonder what lies beyond the thin veil of reality. Years have passed since that fateful night, but the memory remains vivid, a constant reminder of the thin line between our world and the unknown. I share this story not just as a recounting of a personal experience, but as a warning to those who dare to traverse the lonely streets of the night, to those who seek answers in places best left untouched. If you ever find yourself on a late-night bus in Seattle, keep your eyes open and your senses sharp. You never know when the shadows will come alive, when a silent rider will board, or when a non-existent stop will lead you into the depths of a haunting mystery. Respect the boundaries between the living and the dead, for in the heart of the night, the whispers never truly fade, and the shadows watch, ever vigilant, ready to claim those who dare to venture too far into the unknown. Story number 6. Whispers from the empty seat. I still wake up in the dead of night, heart racing and skin crawling, haunted by the memory of that winter night in New York City. It's been years since that eerie ride, but the whispers from the empty seat linger in my mind, a ghostly reminder that some shadows refuse to fade. This is my story, a tale of fear, the unknown, and the thin veil that separates our reality from the supernatural. It was a frigid December evening in 1987, the kind where the cold bites through your layers and the city lights blur into a hazy glow under the heavy snowfall. I was driving my usual route as a bus driver for the Metropolitan Transit Authority, navigating the familiar streets of Manhattan with a sense of routine comfort. The bus, an old but reliable model, had seen better days, much like myself. Yet, it was mine, a sanctuary where I spent countless hours ferrying passengers through the bustling cityscape. That night, the streets were quieter than usual. The snow had slowed traffic to a crawl, and the city's usual cacophony was muffled under the blanket of white. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 12:47 a.m. My shift was nearing its end, and the anticipation of heading home kept me alert. The bus was almost empty, just a few late-night travelers and the occasional lost soul seeking refuge from the biting cold. I took pride in my job, ensuring each passenger reached their destination safely, even during the most grueling nights. But on this particular night, something felt off, a subtle tension that prickled the back of my neck. As I made my way through Times Square, the lights reflecting off the wet pavement created a surreal, almost dreamlike atmosphere. The bus hummed along smoothly until I reached a particularly deserted stretch near the Hudson Yards. It was here that I first heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whispering that seemed to emanate from the back of the bus. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see a passenger who had just boarded, but the last seat in the back was empty, as it had been for the past hour. The whispers continued, growing slightly louder, like voices carried by the wind but coming from within the bus. My heart began to race as I tried to rationalize the sound. Perhaps it was a passenger talking softly, or the bus's old heating system making strange noises. I shook my head, attempting to dispel the unease that was beginning to settle over me. Minutes passed, and the whispers persisted, their source seemingly just out of sight. I reached the next stop, a small, dimly lit bus station with no other passengers waiting. As the bus came to a halt, the whispers intensified, now unmistakably clear. "Help us," they echoed, a desperate plea that sent chills down my spine. I forced myself to stay calm, checking the last seat again. Still empty. My rational mind struggled to find an explanation. No passengers boarding. No one sitting there. The temperature inside the bus seemed to drop suddenly, my breath visible in the icy air. The whispers transformed into soft cries, their tone filled with sorrow and fear. Unable to ignore the unsettling sounds, I made a decision. "All right, let's check the back," I announced to the empty bus, my voice betraying my anxiety. Slowly, I turned around, moving cautiously towards the rear of the bus. The overhead lights flickered intermittently, casting long, wavering shadows across the seats. As I approached the last row, the whispers ceased abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence that weighed heavily on me. My hand reached out to adjust the rearview mirror, only to pull away a chill that seemed to seep into my very bones. I stared at the empty seat, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. Suddenly, the bus lurched forward, the brakes squealing in protest. I slammed my foot on the brake pedal, bringing the bus to a screeching halt. The engine cut off, and the bus was plunged into darkness, save for the dim emergency lights that cast eerie glows on the interior. In the darkness, I felt a presence, a cold, intangible force that pressed against me, making it difficult to breathe. The air grew thick, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than before. "Don't leave us," they pleaded, their voices intertwining in a haunting chorus. Panic surged through me as I realized I wasn't alone. I turned back to the last seat, my heart pounding in my chest. There, sitting in the back, was a figure tall and indistinct, its form shrouded in shadows. The man's head was completely missing, his neck bare and exposed, revealing nothing but a hollow void where his skull should have been. I stumbled back, my mind reeling from the horrifying sight. The figure remained motionless, its empty gaze fixed on me, an unspoken sorrow emanating from its very being. The temperature plummeted further, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I struggled to comprehend what I was witnessing. "Why are you here?" I demanded, my voice cracking with fear. The figure didn't respond, only reaching out a hand towards me. As his fingers extended, the bus seemed to distort around me, the seats warping and twisting in impossible ways. The whispers morphed into screams, the voices of the lost and forgotten echoing through the confined space. I backed away, my legs trembling, but the bus wouldn't move. It was as if an invisible force held me in place. The atmosphere thick with despair and anguish. The headless man began to fade, his form dissipating into the darkness, leaving only the hollow space where he had once been. Desperate to escape, I tried to start the engine again, but the bus remained silent, unresponsive to my frantic attempts. The oppressive silence returned, now tinged with a lingering sense of sorrow that seemed to seep into every corner of the bus. Hours passed, or was it minutes, before I finally managed to start the engine, the bus groaning to life as if reluctant to continue. I accelerated away from the spot, the city lights blurring into a nightmarish haze as I tried to leave the haunting presence behind. The whispers followed me, a ghostly echo that refused to be silenced, their voices fading into the night as the bus sped through the deserted streets. When I finally reached my stop, the bus driver at the end of the line looked at me with a mixture of concern and disbelief. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked, noticing the fear etched into my face. I nodded, too shaken to speak, and hastily disembarked, leaving the bus behind. As I walked home through the empty streets, the memory of the headless man and the desperate whispers haunted every step, a reminder that some shadows are better left undisturbed. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the experience, the image of the headless man, his sorrowful gaze, and the haunting whispers replayed in my mind, a relentless nightmare that refused to fade. I avoided taking the night bus, opting for safer, more familiar routes, but the fear lingered, a constant presence in the back of my mind. One evening, nearly a decade later, I found myself driving home late at night, the city streets quiet and empty. The bus driver signaled that he was nearing his last stop, a small, dimly lit terminal on the outskirts of the city. As I approached, I noticed the same bus I had encountered years ago, its lights flickering in the darkness. Curiosity and an inexplicable sense of déjà vu compelled me to approach the bus. The driver looked up, his eyes meeting mine with a knowing sadness. "Another night," he sighed, shaking his head. "Same old story." Before I could respond, the whispers began anew, soft at first, then growing louder, echoing the desperate pleas of the lost souls trapped within the bus. I watched in horror as the headless man appeared once more, sitting silently in the last seat, his empty gaze fixed on me. Frozen with fear, I realized that some shadows never fade, some stories never end. The headless man reached out a hand, and the whispers enveloped me, pulling me back into the darkness of that haunted bus ride. I screamed, but no sound escaped my lips as I was swallowed by the shadows, forever trapped in the eternal night of the empty seat. If you ever find yourself riding a late-night bus in Chicago, keep your eyes open and your senses sharp. You never know when the whispers will start, or when a shadowy figure will appear, waiting silently in the empty seat, yearning for a soul to join the eternal chorus of the lost. Story number 7. The Headless Rider. I still wake up in the dead of night, heart pounding and drenched in sweat, the memory of that bus ride in Chicago haunting my every restless sleep. It was a chilly October evening in 1985, the kind where the city lights blur into streaks of gold and white under the weight of a heavy fog. I never took the night bus again after that night, but the image of the headless man lingers in my mind, a ghostly reminder that some horrors are all too real. I was 12 years old, sitting near the window of the number 53 bus heading downtown. My mom had insisted I take the bus alone for the first time, a small step towards independence. I remember clutching my backpack tightly, eyes wide with a mix of excitement and apprehension. The bus was nearly empty, just a few late-night travelers seeking the warmth of their homes after a long day. As the bus rolled along the familiar streets, I glanced out the window, watching the city pass by in a haze of headlights and shadows. That's when I saw him, a tall, elderly man stepping onto the bus at the corner of Elm and 14th. He moved with a slow, deliberate gait, his heavy coat and wide-brimmed hat obscuring most of his face. There was something unsettling about him, a presence that made me shift uncomfortably in my seat. He chose the seat across from me, his back to the window. I tried to focus on my book, but my eyes kept drifting back to him. The man's hands were large, resting calmly on his lap, but his posture seemed rigid, almost unnatural. As the bus continued its journey, the streets grew darker, the buildings casting long, eerie shadows that danced along the pavement. About 15 minutes into the ride, the bus entered a particularly desolate stretch of road, flanked by towering skyscrapers that seemed to swallow the light. The windows fogged up slightly, and the atmosphere inside the bus grew thick with silence. It was then that I noticed something strange. His head was missing, or rather, it was as if it had been ripped off, leaving his neck bare and exposed. My blood ran cold as I stared in disbelief, the reality of the situation sinking in with terrifying clarity. Panic surged through me, my mind racing to comprehend what I was seeing. The man's body remained eerily still, his clothing immaculate despite the apparent mutilation. I wanted to scream, to alert someone, but my voice was trapped in my throat. The other passengers remained oblivious, lost in their own worlds, unaware of the horror unfolding before them. I felt a chill run down my spine, the room temperature dropping as if the presence of the headless man was sucking the warmth out of the bus. My heart hammered against my ribs, each beat echoing in my ears louder than the hum of the engine. The man's hand moved slowly, reaching out as if to grab something or someone. I could see the desperation in his gesture, a silent plea that sent shivers down my spine. Time seemed to warp, stretching into an endless night. The bus felt like it was moving in slow motion, each second dragging on unbearably. I glanced around, hoping for a glimpse of a head or some sign that the man was still whole. But all I saw was the empty space where his head should have been. The realization that he was truly headless sent waves of fear crashing over me. Without thinking, I sprang to my feet, knocking over my seat and causing a commotion. "Someone help!" I cried, my voice finally breaking free from its prison. The other passengers stirred, looking around in confusion as the headless man remained motionless, his empty neck staring back at us. A hushed silence fell over the bus, broken only by the distant wail of a siren. I didn't wait for anyone to respond. I bolted towards the exit, my legs pumping with desperate speed. The man reached out again, his hand passing through me as if I were made of smoke. I could feel his sorrow, his longing for something I couldn't understand. But I was too terrified to stop, pushing past the other passengers and stumbling onto the deserted street. The bus driver looked back in alarm, but the headless man had vanished as abruptly as he had appeared. My breath came in ragged gasps, the night air cold against my skin. I ran without direction, the city's towering buildings looming like silent guardians in the darkness. Every shadow seemed to twist and contort, every alleyway a potential hiding spot for the apparition I had witnessed. I reached my home just as dawn began to break, the first light of day casting long shadows across the pavement. My mom was waiting at the door, worry etched into her face. I burst through the entrance, gasping for breath, tears streaming down my cheeks. "Mom, something terrible happened on the bus." I managed to choke out. She pulled me into a tight embrace, soothing words failing to calm the terror that still gripped me. I recounted the events, the headless man, his desperate gestures, and my frantic escape. She listened intently, her eyes wide with concern. But I could tell she didn't believe me. It was too fantastical, too horrifying to accept as reality. In the days that followed, I tried to move past the incident, but the image of the headless man haunted me. I avoided taking the bus at night, opting for safer, more familiar routes. My friends laughed off my story, teasing me about making it up. But the fear remained, a constant presence in the back of my mind. Years went by, and the memory of that night began to fade, overshadowed by the passage of time and the normalcy of everyday life. But sometimes, late at night, I catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadowy figure with an empty neck staring back at me. The fear resurfaces, reminding me that some horrors never truly leave us. One night, nearly 30 years later, I found myself riding the same bus route, nostalgic for the old days. The city was quieter now, the streets less bustling, the night air still carrying a sense of unease. I took my usual seat near the window, the memory of that night lingering like a shadow. As the bus rolled along, I noticed an elderly man boarding, his presence immediately sending a chill down my spine. He moved with the same slow, deliberate gait, his hat and coat obscuring most of his face. My heart raced, the years melting away as the scene replayed before me. And then, as we passed a particularly dark stretch of road, he leaned down towards me. I turned to look, my breath catching in my throat. There it was, the unmistakable sight of his empty neck, the place where his head should have been. Time stood still as fear consumed me, memories flooding back with intense clarity. The man reached out a hand, his gesture mirroring the desperation I had witnessed decades ago. I bolted from my seat, the bus driver shouting in alarm as I hurriedly exited at the next stop. The headless man remained seated, watching as I fled into the early morning light. I never took the night bus again, but the image of that headless rider remains, a spectral reminder that some fears never fade, and some ghosts never find peace. If you ever find yourself riding the late-night buses in Chicago, keep your eyes open and your senses sharp. You never know when the shadows will come alive, and the past will reach out to claim another soul lost to the darkness.